Hello everyone and welcome to this session on Paper 2, Topic 2, which is Global Development. This session is going to cover the entire topic in summary, so it's a revision of the entire topic and is going to cover things in not as much detail as you might find in the lesson by lesson format in the Global Development folder. But hopefully if you've already covered those sessions and you just want a recap, then this session is for you. Please feel free obviously to pause at any point in the video, make any notes you want to make at any stage, and if there's any queries that come up as a result of it, you can either email me or your teacher or come and speak to me when you're next in school. Okay, so this in summary is paper 2, topic 2. So of the second paper, this will be the middle topic you'll be covering, and its official title is Global Development, and it starts off straight away by defining what we mean by development. So there are many ways that we can define development, and when we look at development, we include a number of things. So it's not just about how wealthy something is or somewhere is, it's also to do with the quality of life of a country, and a lot of different factors can all be tied into this concept of quality of life. Access to medical care, access to good education, your nutritional availability of products, food, that sort of thing, housing, corruption, all these things can all affect the development of a place and all be used in defining development. So using the text which is taken from the revision guide, so development is a term that measures how advanced a country is compared to another country. And now you can see on this map that there is a difference between certain nations of the world, and actually we cover this in the sessions by looking at something called the Brandt report and the Brandt line, and which divides the world into kind of what they classed, or Brandt classed, as the rich north and the poor south, which is a bit strange because Australia and New Zealand are included in the rich north despite being in the southern hemisphere. But there's a wibbly-wobbly line essentially that goes around the Earth based on this report, and it's a bit simplified, and what it defines the countries within is based on income. So you've got your high-income countries, which on this map look blue, and your low-income countries, which are on this map red. Now, obviously, this is a slightly outdated concept, and since then, China is a good example, and places like Brazil or the BRIC nations, India as well, have emerged as developing or emerging countries, and therefore it's not really fair to class them as the poor south or low-income countries because they're not really within the same bracket. So development is primarily based on economic measures, but also includes social, political and environmental factors as well. And defining development is a very difficult thing, but being aware of the different things that can be linked into development is quite important. Now, when it comes to factors that can affect human development, so that these quality of life factors, the mind map below the what is development box and map shows you some of the things that the exam board want you to consider. So starting in the top left, you've got economic development, which we've covered. People's personal wealth, how much money they've got, and that's what helped define this high income, low income, rich north, poor south map that you see at the top. But also within that is this idea of job security. And the cost of living. So if your life is expensive, then it doesn't matter what your income is, it's all relative. When it comes to social factors, that can include things like access to healthcare, which I mentioned, and education, but also housing and the ability to go and do stuff, fun stuff, recreational things. Is there a local skate park nearby, and that sort of thing. Technological factors can also affect human development of a country, and we look at this in a bit when we look at India specifically, and how India has a technology divide, and that includes things like electrification. So is there electricity in that particular part of the country? Does it have internet access, and how good is the internet access around the entire country? Is the Wi-Fi signal bad, or does it have no internet whatsoever? Is the farming technology good? Do you still use a spade and a hoe, or do you use a big old Massey Ferguson GPS controlled tractor? That sort of thing. Cultural human development can involve things like, do you have a democracy? Do you have equality? Do you have a good work-life balance? Have you got a traditional kind of culture where women are seen as second-class citizens, or do you have more cultural balance to your country? So all of these factors can be considered things that are that can help you work out the development rate of a country, and that's why working out which countries are more or less developed is actually a very difficult thing to do because there are so many factors involved. One of the most basic things, though, that we like to use and measure is food and water security. Your access to food or your access to clean, safe water is critical when it comes to actually having a basis for a country to develop, because it doesn't matter how rich you are, if you are going to starve to death or die of thirst or get a disease from the water you drink, then that money's not going to help you very much. So when it comes to food security, you need to have enough food production for your needs, but also there's a bit of an imbalance globally between how much food is being produced and how much food is being consumed by places. And often, if you are consuming more than you are producing or able to ship in, then you have a lack of food security. So you don't have enough food to meet your means. Now, food security can happen, or insecurity can happen, because of a variety of things. And the most obvious one is that you don't have enough of it available. There's not enough food grown in your country for you to get to. Access is another factor. So if you can't grow enough food, some countries still don't have any kind of food insecurity because they're able to ship it in from other places very easily. Not just access to any food source, but also having the right food source and enough nutrition within the food sources that you eat. So this idea of undernutrition, malnourishment, not having enough nutrients is just as important as having food in general. You and I know that if you ate chips every day, you'd be full, but you wouldn't be healthy. And so malnourishment, not having enough variety of food, is also critical. But also knowledge is a thing that can affect food security. Do you have the available knowledge to make best use of the food that you have? Are you growing the right crops at the right time? Are you making sure that you are rotating your crops? Crop rotation is something we know about and farmers know about in this country, because they know that if they use the same of one crop all the time, it will starve the soil of the same nutrients and make that soil infertile. But if you plant different things at different times or different cycles, then you never lose more than a small amount of nutrients, and it can always re-establish and it can regenerate. So that's also important in food security. And another aspect of development, a basic aspect, is water security. And not having enough water or not having enough clean, safe water is really, really important. And again, just like food security, there are different things that can lead to water insecurity. That can mean you don't have enough water available to you. Again, the obvious one is you just don't simply have enough in your climate. You live in a desert area. That would be the most obvious thing you think about. Places that don't have enough safe, clean water, deserts are going to be top of your list. Access to water. If the water falls from the sky, but you don't collect it, store it, treat it, then you have lack of access to available water. Most countries in the world that are classed as developed have piped systems. They've got networks that span the entire country. Other places just have buckets, and it's not a very good, safe and efficient way to gather and access water resources that are available from your climate. Sometimes it's just a case of cost. Sometimes water just costs simply too much for the people to adequately afford it. And when we look at changing cities, which is a different topic on paper 2, you look at how in Mexico City there's a lack of affordable water in certain parts of the city, and an unequal availability of that water, which is being just brought in by trucks and pumped into water butts for people. And safe water, that how clean the water is another factor. The minute water touches a surface or the floor, it is less safe. It can pick up diseases, it can pick up bacteria, it can pick up all sorts of problems that when you don't treat it can lead to problems with health. And again, that's all tied into water security. So when we define development, we need to look at, firstly, economic factors, social factors, technological factors, cultural factors, but we also need to look at the basic human needs of food and water security. And you need to be aware as a GCSE geographer of what things can affect food security and what things can affect water security. And that availability, the access, and the affordability are things that you need to be aware of. Okay, so obviously if I go through fast for you to write notes on any of these things, ideally you'd be using these revision sessions alongside your notes just to check you've got them, reread them when I talk about them. This probably represents a good 2 or 3 pages worth of your notes. So if you've got stuff missing, feel free to pause the screen and add it wherever you wish. Okay. So the next part, obviously, of the topic of development in general is how do we measure it? So we mentioned that, defining development is a difficult thing to do because of the different aspects involved. But measuring those different aspects is also very difficult, because if you want to define development by just health, it's a bit easier to measure because you can measure life expectancy, number of doctors per person, infant mortality, so amount of spend per head on healthcare. But we don't just use health data to define development, do we? We use economic data, we use social factors, other cultural factors. So because for every single one of those, and I picked health as one example, and I came up with 4 or 5 different ways you can measure how developed a place's healthcare is. Life expectancy, nutrition, all those things. But then when you add in economic factors, and you add in cultural factors, and you add in education, development indicators, things that show you how developed a country is, can be in the thousands. There are hundreds and even thousands of stats that you can use to help you say how developed a country is. And using just one stat is never particularly useful, but we often do. We often focus on wealth. We focus on how much money or how much value a country has or generates. And the thing we call the main sort of stat we use for wealth is called gross domestic product, or GDP. And so as a single measure of development, GDP is often the one that we go to first. And that's often because if a country is wealthy, you assume that it's got the money to spend on healthcare and education and nutrition and all those things that help create a developed country and help define that development aspect. But we know that it's not always spent in the right way, on the right thing in every single country. Now, in lessons, you might have seen the example of Qatar, which is one of the wealthiest countries per person, statistically, but compared that to Myanmar, which is a very impoverished nation with very much low incomes, but the literacy rate of Myanmar is far higher than in Qatar, even though they're poorer. So education obviously spend is much higher or much more significant, and culturally speaking much more valued in Myanmar than it is in Qatar. Okay, so it's only a small minority of people that maybe hold the wealth in Qatar. So that's one example of 2 countries and how they differ in terms of just looking at one stat. And gross domestic product or wealth is one of those factors, and it's a single measure. The other thing we use is a composite measure, and the one that we really pinpoint is Human Development Index, or HDI. And this is better than GDP, in my opinion, because it covers 3 factors. It looks at life expectancy, it looks at education factors, and it looks at wealth as well. So it looks at average income rather than overall country's wealth. And it focuses on other social factors within that information too. So mean years of schooling for education, I think life expectancy from birth, and the income on average per person in the country. And it uses those to come up with a score of between 0 and 1. And that the closer to 1 you get, the more developed you are according to your Human Development Index. So on this slide, you've got some information obviously on the left-hand side, and I've just explained how development can be measured using GDP or Human Development Index, but there are loads of different other things that you can use to measure development. and economic indicators are one factor, and social and political factors are another. And if you look at the table, it shows you the top 5 countries depending on what you're looking at, and the list is not the same. So if you were just looking at wealth, the top country in the world by wealth is the USA. $17 billion. Okay, so lots and lots of money there, and then followed by China and Japan, Germany, and then the UK. These stats will vary from year to year. If you look at then GDP per capita, that is a different story. Now, GDP is the whole wealth of a country. GDP per capita, that per capita means per person. So already, because the USA has a greater population than somewhere like Monaco, the share of wealth is more spread. So Monaco, which is a very tiny population of very, very wealthy people, has the highest GDP per person of anywhere in the world, followed by Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, Qatar, and Norway. And the top 3 have in common the fact they are very small countries with relatively very wealthy people that live there. And the final column shows a completely different thing, which is the HDI, which are those 3 measures: the income per person, their life expectancy from birth, and the mean years of schooling. And on top of that is Norway, which is wealthy country per person. It's in the top 5 of GDP per capita, but it gets everything else right too, it seems. Australia, which doesn't appear on either of the other 2 lists, is second for HDI on this list. Switzerland, another one. Denmark, the Netherlands. All of these countries, aside from Norway, don't appear on the GDP list at all. And shamefully, the UK, which is one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, doesn't appear in the top 5 of the HDI list either. So this just shows you how, depending on how you measure development, will determine which countries are most or least developed. So from an exam perspective, you need to be aware that you can use these 2 measures, and one of them is probably more useful than the other. You need to be aware of what is included in HDI. Okay, what factors do we actually use to get that figure between 0 and 1, and why that might be classed as an overall better measure of development. Okay, so I've talked about gross domestic product, and there's a definition about what GDP is and what GDP per capita is, if you want to get that definition written down. There's HDI, so there you go, it tells you life expectancy, average years in education, and gross national income, which is, rather than GDP, it's like GDP per capita. So it's wealth, health, and education all put together to give you that score. Now, there's another factor we need to consider within this, this is why just because you're wealthy doesn't necessarily make you developed argument comes in, because a lot of the time the wealth isn't evenly spread. And that's why in lessons we looked at very briefly, but I'm going to mention it in this session as well, this idea of political corruption. Some parts of the world and some governments in the world aren't necessarily playing with a straight bat. They are particularly lacking in trustworthiness, shall we say. And there are lots of different indices and things like tables that measure corruption. There's the corruption index, and governments can be defined as to whether they are highly corrupt or very clean. And a very clean government is a not very corrupt one, a good one. Now, the UK comes out quite well, and unsurprisingly, actually, places that appear on that Human Development Index list on the table on the screen now, so Norway, Australia, Switzerland, Denmark, Netherlands, are all to be found in the top 10, 15 countries with lowest corruption, with the very clean governments. Places near the bottom of the list tend to be places that are less developed, places where there's maybe a strong military presence that rule and govern, and unstable governments. So, places with maybe dictatorships, that sort of thing. So corruption is something we need to also consider when we actually measure development. So again, on this slide, feel free to pause to make any extra notes on definitions for GDP, HDI, and make a note about political corruption too. Okay? Right, so now some geographical skills, and again, map skills, world map skills often appear in all potential topics really, but we need to be aware that globally speaking, development is varied, is uneven development around the world. I'm sure we're aware that the UK is more developed than Burkina Faso in Africa, for example. And so you just being aware that development as uneven is useful, but you need to also maybe need to develop the skill of describing where this uneven development is and where places are or are less developed. So here you go. Here's a worked example, which is again taken from the revision guide from the exam board themselves. And the question is: describe the global pattern of GDP per capita as shown on the choropleth map opposite. So this factor, this is just showing you GDP per person, the wealth per person, and it's color coded. So the places that are pink with the biggest range are where the GDP per capita is 22,000 to 120,000, and so everywhere pink is basically wealthy. Then the orange is the next stage down. And then you've got your pink to blue to green, and then ignore the no data ones because they don't really offer you much. Okay, so have a go at describing this. It's for 3 marks. You've got data. You should be using directions. You've got a compass there. You've even got a scale on this map. Not that that's particularly useful in this case. But what I'd like you to do is try and use your knowledge of the world as well as your knowledge of compass directions and regions to describe the development and where the places are most developed in terms of GDP and where they are maybe least developed in terms of GDP from this map. Okay, pause the screen, give yourself 3 or 4 minutes to do that, write an answer down, and then when you have, you can I'll reveal an answer for you. Okay, so hopefully your answer looks a little bit like, and there's the advice there on there. It says when a question asks you to describe a pattern, describe general trends, try and give specific details as well. That is important, even though it says it's not. So the general pattern shows that GDP is higher in places maybe in the northern hemisphere. So some of you may have identified there's a bit of a north-south split. Although there is a bit of inaccuracy there, so I wouldn't have gone for that. I would have certainly mentioned the northwest hemispheres or quarter of the earth really. So Western Europe and North America. You've also got kind of middle-income countries in South America and places like Russia and China. So again, you could have mentioned specific places, but identifying where the lowest levels of economic development are is very obvious. You can see it in the continent of Africa. Okay, so the general pattern shows higher GDP tends to be found in the countries in the northern hemisphere. That's worth a mark. The USA have one of the highest at 50,000 to 60,000, although this map doesn't show you that, so I don't know how they could write that down in the answer. The lowest GDP tends to be found in the southern hemisphere, especially Central Africa. That's definitely worth a mark, and again, using data in your answer is useful too. Okay, and if you've got any anomalies that don't fit the pattern, so for example if it says northern hemisphere is the richest, you need to mention also Australia, New Zealand, and if you want to put in there that they're still classed as the rich north from the Brant line, then that shows your depth of knowledge. Okay, so now we recognise that global development is uneven. We need to try and think about why. So the factors that can affect development are many and varied, but again, the example would like to just focus you in on a few. So firstly, physical factors that can affect development level. Firstly, how big a country is. Does it have natural hazards? Is it landlocked? Is it a good climate or a particularly difficult climate? All of those physical, naturally occurring factors will affect your level of equality. So if you're in Antarctica, you're not going to be able to start growing really cash-rich crops there because it's a frozen wasteland. So that would be a physical factor which affects your level of development if you lived in Antarctica, but officially it's not populated. Historical factors as well. Now these are things like colonial links. Think about the UK's relationship with India from your lessons. Okay, so we've got very strong links with India, and that has helped India develop both through the aid we've sent there, but also through the education system and healthcare systems and trade and all those things that go along with colonial links, but and trading relationships. But also there's another side to that. If your colonial links are more in line with the former colonies in Africa, then as European countries, often it was European countries, left African nations which gained independence, they left them in a bit of a state of turmoil and without much governance in place. And that has actually restricted development and led to things like ongoing conflicts and corruption and all sorts of problems. So historical factors can be, play in your favour, but can also go against you too. And economic factors in terms of the type of jobs you have. Do you rely mostly on agriculture, which is very subject to the elements? If a volcano erupts over your crops, then you've had it. Or do you have well-developed economies like finance, a variety of different economies and different types of industry? Are you in debt? Are you an African nation that's borrowed a lot of money, for example, and therefore have to pay back a lot of the interest alongside trying to develop your country too? And have you invested in things that will get you to a developed state in healthcare and education, like India have? India have developed their healthcare and education systems, and that's led to an educated workforce, which has meant that foreign direct investment has come in and helped India really boost their level of overall development long term. Okay, so these are all different factors that can affect global development and lead to these inequalities, because some places are, so let's take northern African nations that are desert areas, so they can't grow very much. That's a physical factor, with a very dry climate, as to Ethiopia, for example, with former colonial links where European nations have just left them to it. And they also rely massively on agriculture, which is in a desert area or a place that suffers drought regularly, a particularly unreliable sort of industry. And so they don't even have money to spend in developing education and healthcare, because they're spending any money they get through aid on survival. So there you go, it hits all three. Ethiopia has physical things that mean that they're less developed, historical factors, and economic factors, which mean that they really are going to struggle to move past lower levels of development anytime soon. So now we're going to focus in on the UK, because there's always a little UK focus with most of this. Most of the specification, even in every single topic, we look at how the UK is affected. So we keep it close to home before we then spray out to India. And the UK is not a place that has 100% development evenly across its north and south areas as well. And the southeast is considered a far more developed part of the country than the northeast, for example. And again, the same sorts of factors can be used to explain why in this case as well. So physical factors, historic factors, economic factors can all also explain why the UK has variations in its development. So world variations, one thing, and UK development variations is another factor to consider. So in the London and the South East, there is generally a higher standard of living than there is in the North East and Northwest, and the factors that play there are like I say, within those categories of physical, historic, and economic. So the physical factors that affect the UK's development are how remote a place is. The northwest of Scotland, the Highlands, are mountainous, cold, wet often, not easy to build on, not easy to farm on, not really the place you're going to set up a hotel on, that sort of thing. So remoteness, if you can't get there, the road network's bad, the rail network's bad, there's no airports, that sort of thing, there's no potential for an industry, then that's going to affect your level of development. So parts of the UK that are remote with poor roads, not much prospect of industry, are going to be less developed than places that have the opposite to that. Historically as well, some parts of the country, like the northeast, were incredibly prosperous when coal mining was going on, and when manufacturing was something which the UK did a lot more of, like heavy metal manufacturing, like steel industry and car manufacturing, which goes on a little bit still, but very, very much less than it used to, because a lot of that has been outsourced abroad through deindustrialization. And again, this is where development links to another one of your human topics, changing cities. Because of deindustrialization, the UK has changed significantly, and Norwich was a place where deindustrialization affected them, and they then developed a financial industry instead. But parts of the northeast haven't been so lucky, and there are lots of parts of the northeast that are really struggling economically, because when the coal mines closed and the steel works kind of declined hugely, it left a lot of people who had a very specific skill set without a job. And they're not just going to go and become a banker, they're going to be struggling to find work, and unemployment levels can affect that hugely. And that links in really to economic factors too. So employment rates, how much money you earn, how much the houses cost. So in London, for example, house prices are huge relative to everywhere else in the country. And how good your roads are. A lot of people say Norfolk is isolated away from the rest of the world and the rest of the country, but has worked hard to try and develop some of those infrastructure links, but still suffers with bad broadband connections, for example, and quite a poor. The A11 being dualled was like massive news because Norfolk is a place with not a single mile of motorway, and I love that about Norfolk, but it does restrict somewhat Norfolk's ability to develop. But we've still got links. We've got an airport which links to Schiphol, and we have got a road to London, the A11, and things like that. So, we're not completely isolated. Okay, so now we've looked at how the UK varies with regards to its development, and again, importantly, why, using those three factors. We now need to start to look at what the impacts of that are. So, yes, we know why countries are developed differently at different rates, but what effect does that have? Well, this is a mind map that I think is worthwhile you creating as I talk about it. So again, if you're using this with notes in front of you or you're just listening, fine, doesn't matter, but it's definitely worth being a bit more involved. So because of uneven development, there is an uneven impact of things going on. And we'll start with health. With regards to health, because you've got less money to invest in healthcare, or you've got a poorer climate maybe, or any of those factors, those historic, physical or economic factors, healthcare can be limited in places that are developing. And because there's less healthcare available, so less doctors, or fewer vaccinations, maybe not as many surgeries, facilities, it's going to have an effect on the health of the population, which will restrict the development of that place. Employment-wise, in developing countries, there's again lack of employment opportunities. A lot of the jobs are labour intensive, like agriculture. They don't offer much money. They don't offer very much job security. And even in emerging countries, the type of employment which maybe moves away from agriculture is still what we'd call informal. So selling stuff in the market stalls, in the streets, you don't get a pension with that. You don't get job security. If you don't make sales that day, you don't make money. Whereas as a teacher, if you guys don't turn up to class, I still get paid. So there are fewer benefits, there are fewer safeguards with regards to certain areas of the world with regards to employment, and that again is linked to development. We've already talked about food and water security. So countries that are developing which lack access to good nutritious food and clean water can lead to malnourishment, dehydration, starvation, widespread famine, basically. And because of water predominantly, there might not be enough water to grow food. So water is the key here. If you've got good clean water and enough of it, you can grow food to survive, but also not get, bilharzia or cholera from, toxic water or infected water. Technologically speaking, there is less investment in technology, and we can see this when we look at India in the later part of this topic. There's a huge digital divide in India where the periphery areas don't have access to broadband or internet at all. In fact, very few of them have mobile phones or even the skills to use those mobile phones. And we focus more on what's called appropriate technology to help countries develop. So, like a place that requires clean, safe water, giving them a mobile phone is no good. Oh, hello Tesco's, can you deliver to Nigeria, please? No. Bad example, really, Nigeria, but Ethiopia, for example. But if you build a hand pump well or a hand dug well, that's appropriate. It's easy to understand, it works, it provides you with what you need, and from there is a platform for you to then maybe develop more. Education, generally speaking, literacy rates are lower in places in the developing world. There's less schools and poor attendance because either people can't afford to go or they are spending all the time working the land because that's going to lead to survival, whereas education is considered more of a luxury. And people with obviously the least education often are found in the largest families, and again that links into food and water security and economic issues because there's not enough food to go around the family, but also there's not enough jobs available for those people. So unemployment rate is higher too. And then access to housing, which is something we don't consider. Shanty houses are developed as a result of lack of access to houses, and about 30% of the world's population live in informal housing, slums. 30%. It's just a ridiculous number of the world's population. In fact, I'd question that figure. It's so high. But in terms of the impact that has, it's children will die before 6 million children die before they reach their fifth birthday, in globally speaking, and a lot of that is down to spread of disease, lack of nutrition, lack of healthcare, and lack of safe, sanitary, warm housing, shelter. Okay, is a primary basic need. So here you've got a mind map which shows you, really, it focuses on the developing world, but how the developing world are impacted by their lack of development, and what the knock-on effects are with regards to their health and their life expectancy and education and technology and all these things. Okay, so what are we doing about it? What internationally are the world doing to try and tackle some of these issues about that are caused by uneven global development? Because we talk about cancelling third world debt, and that would be a great thing, but it's not happening. So what are we doing about it? Aid is one of the main things. We are providing aid, and when we did lessons on aid, we divided it up into a few things. Short term, which is to really help countries when they've got a natural disaster, a famine. It's called humanitarian aid, so water, food, shelter, medicine, that sort of stuff. But also development aid, which is more long term. So money to help countries get what they need to develop. Machinery, oil to run the machinery, road networks, building those, airports. But also money which can be used to help educate the population so they have the skills to then develop an industry themselves. The expression, give a man a fish, he eats for a day, teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. That's the kind of development aid principle, really. There is lots of other agreements that help with trade, and fair trade is one of those examples. So trade agreements, what they do is they make it easier for countries to sell and buy goods from other countries or to other countries, and those trade agreements and trade links can be really beneficial because it just cuts the cost of everything. And one of the biggest problems with us leaving the EU has been the barriers to trade and the tariffs and stuff like that, which are going to be applied and will start to be applied. Although the UK feel fairly confident they can overcome those barriers because, as a wealthy nation you can. But if you don't have trade barriers, if you've got trade barriers, and again I'll use India as our example. India were a very inward-looking country with trade barriers. They couldn't trade, and the minute they lifted those trade barriers, they joined trading blocks like the Commonwealth bloc and the Asian trading bloc. They actually opened their borders up to more trade and therefore made more money, which helped them develop. And fair trade is something which is a concept which gives the producer of goods a better bit of money for what they're producing, rather than just giving them very little along the chain. Give them a little bit more, because fair trade it just means that they get basically a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, if that makes sense, or slightly fairer. Still not fair, but fairer. And looking at this, this comes up so much in this topic, it's absolutely essential that you're aware of it. So FDI, foreign direct investment. We mention it with regards to how China have developed, how India developed, and it really involves private companies, big companies, transnational corporations, spending money in other countries so that they can exploit something that they've got. Okay, so let's take Apple. For example, Apple might set up a factory for their mobile phones in India or China, wherever. And what they'll need to do is make sure they can get their goods in and out well. So they'll create a good infrastructure, ports, roads, whatever. They'll build a factory which comes up to safety standards, which might have aircon. They'll need a workforce which is educated enough to build their phone components or put them together. So they'll help educate them. They'll provide an education program. And so all of these things, which are directly linked to developing a country, are being invested by a private company that are from abroad. Foreign direct investment is called. So that's not just because Apple or any of those companies are doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They're doing it because in the long run, it's going to save them millions, billions of dollars worth of wages and salaries and stuff like that. So FDI is something which is an investment by these companies. They'll get money back because of what they're doing, but it also benefits the country that receives that FDI because they get some of the things that require to develop done for them by someone else's money. So it's really good, and there's a summary really of three good and three negative things though as well about FDI. So when a company invests in a different country, it brings in that investment, provides jobs, it brings in brands, it improves education infrastructure, can push wages up. But if you're a local producer of a mobile phone, not like a market seller, but if, let's say, in India producing a mobile phone and then Apple comes in, then you're out of business basically because it can outsell local products. It also isn't reliable. They're a company after all. They can open a factory, but they can also close it. If things aren't going well, they'll say, well, that's it, we're closing, end of. They don't have any, particular ties to a country other than to make money. So if they stop making money, they'll close it all down, and then the country that's left with the unemployment rate is up the Swanee basically. And also in some cases there's been a lack of regulation. So Primark is a good example of this. In Bangladesh, Primark built a factory which was used to manufacture their clothes, which they then sell really cheaply in Primark, everywhere around the world. But the people that regulated the factory were people that were in a country which didn't have very good safety standards. And so when the factory collapsed and killed hundreds of the employees of Primark, which actually happened, just look it up, okay, look Google. Primark obviously claimed, and I'll do a disclaimer, don't sue me Primark, they allegedly have said that they, followed all safety standards, or they were misled or other sorts of things. But essentially, they were thought of as not really taking as much responsibility as they probably could have or should have in that scenario. And whoever is to blame is up in the air, but at the same time, there can be those negative consequences. But also, making goods isn't something that doesn't have any environmental consequence. It produces greenhouse gas emissions. It can lead to pollution of water supplies locally, and that can affect people further down the river who have nothing to do with Coca-Cola or whatever. Okay, if Coca-Cola are using all the water or a lot of the water for that area, who's the people that miss out are the people that are further downstream from where Coca-Cola are taking the water out. So yes, it's providing jobs, but it's also causing knock-on effects which aren't positive for other people who have nothing to do with it. And the graph you've got there just shows you the foreign direct investment in India and China. And you can see China has been a big recipient for a number of years, but India is on the up. And actually, 2018 received more FDI than China did. And that's a result of India developing its educated workforce. So FDI, important concept. Now, strategies to help reduce issues or help improve development in a country can be one of two. They can be a top-down strategy or a bottom-up strategy. And this little useful diagram shows you the difference between the two. So top-down development, and I'll just put the information on there, is something which mostly is decided by the national governments and TNCs, companies, okay? The government of India plus Apple or Coca-Cola. Now, local people, although are consulted, they're less important in the influence with regards to this. They don't really have a say. So they tend to be big, expensive, large-scale projects, cost a lot of money, require a lot of expense, require a lot of technology, sophisticated technology to install it, to maintain it, to operate it. And that's why it involves governments and companies with a lot of money. Local people are kind of just told about it, and they will benefit from it. They might lose out too, but they will often benefit from it as well. Now, bottom-up strategies, and again you can see from the handy little graphic, are far more local community focused. So the big blue circle there tells you that they are a big factor in the decision-making process. Now the orange circle in this occasion is not a TNC. This is an NGO, but often a charity. So Oxfam, WaterAid. So top-down development refers to generally governments plus big businesses, and local people are there, sort of. Whereas bottom-up mainly focuses on locals and charities, and national governments kind of help oversee it or help cut down barriers to it and stuff like that. But it's largely a smaller benefit, more appropriate technology that local people with less education can operate and maintain and repair, but benefits smaller groups and smaller communities with a very specific issue like safe water. And we looked at a couple of examples of WaterAid and how they supported groups of people in African nations. So top down and bottom up. Now, you need to be aware of how successful top-down development is, and we use the example of the Three Gorges Dam to give you really specific information here. And the Three Gorges Dam is a really good one to use. Even though it's not in India, it's in China, it's got so much detail and information. So I urge you to go back over your notes. So, because on here, okay, what you've got on this summary is a very generic summary about the good and the bad of top-down development. Okay, so good. You can get large sums of money. They're TNCs, so they foot the bill. It can benefit thousands, millions of people in some cases. It can give you access to great experts, to great technology. But money doesn't come for free. You know, you don't get out for now. So there is often strings attached. You know, the building of Hinkley Point C, although China and France are funding most of it for the British government, they're getting lots out of it too. So it's not all win-win for just the UK. Local people might not benefit or might not have a say. And again, the Three Gorges Dam provides you with lots of specific information about the number of people that had to move and the villages that were flooded and all that sort of stuff. And investment from TNCs can often drive down wages because there's a lot of competition for jobs there. But I would really urge you to get onto your notes about the Three Gorges Dam. So rather than just having generic stuff about what's good and bad about top-down development, you've got specific examples from the Three Gorges Dam and how it affects the environment, economically speaking as well, and socially, because you've got loads of detail there. Right, now I'm going to focus on India for the sort of the last part of this revision session. So even though I haven't, gone over the Three Gorges Dam for you in this PowerPoint, again, if you want any extra detail, please come and see me and I can help you out with that. So India now, and a focus for the remainder of these lessons is on India and India's development specifically. So you will get questions that ask you to refer to India or an emerging country, likely India, because that's the one we've taught you about basically. And you need to know lots about India, where it is, why it's important, culturally, historically, economically, all those things. But the first thing is knowing where India is. So here you go. Here's India's location. It's in the northern hemisphere, but the southern tip of India goes into the Indian Ocean. It's got international borders with countries like Pakistan, China, Bangladesh. I mean, it says borders 6 countries. It also borders China, which it hasn't actually mentioned in that particular description. So that's why you should never always trust just the revision guide. It's got island groups nearby, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, and there's a lot of history of cannibalism and lots of tribal kind of stories and tales about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands that are fascinating. Look them up, great. It's in the northern hemisphere, and it's we're going to look at how it's kind of affected with regards to monsoons in a bit as well. Okay, so this is where India is, and I'm hoping by now you know where India is. So we need to know India's importance in a number of ways, and the first one is culturally speaking. So it's got regional importance in the fact that 80% of India's population are Hindu, and it's got other religions like Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism as well. At the same time, it's also the birthplace to five major world religions. And globally speaking, other cultural influences. It doesn't even mention cuisine on this PowerPoint, but cuisine is spread around the world. It's got the third largest Muslim population anywhere in the world. It's got the Bollywood industry, which makes 1,600 films a year, probably fewer, but than this year, but because of COVID. But certainly the most prolific film industry anywhere in the world, and they are some of the most watched films anywhere in the world because the population of India is very vast. So culturally, India is a big deal. Politically, it's a big deal as well. It's a part of the World Trade Organization. It's a part of the UN and all these other international organizations. It's the largest country in the Indian subcontinent. Don't worry about that too much. It's a big player when it comes to Southeast Asia. It's got population spread largely across 6 main states, but over 1.3 billion people live in India, and that figure is obviously going up all the time. Second most populated country in the world, and will be the most populated country in the world very soon, I imagine by 2030 probably at least. Seventh largest country in terms of its area as well. So again, politically, it's a big deal. Environmentally speaking, as you can see, it's a different font because they didn't actually have this in the revision guide, although it is in the spec. So I'm adding a bit more here. It's got monsoon climate in the northeast and the southwest, but at different times of year. Regionally speaking, it's got mountains in the north, and globally, it produces the third most CO2 emissions of any country. So again, environmentally speaking, India is again important to be aware of. And socially, again, India has got a huge population spread over its country. It's got social ranks known as caste system. So the caste system associated with Hinduism is basically a kind of a society's ranking system, which is still very prevalent in India. And again, you'll look at your notes for a bit more detail about it. It's got a large population of people around the world known as the diaspora, 20 million or so, who are spread across 100 countries, and they send money back to India from those countries and the work that they do. And they generate income globally. That's the point I've made about the diaspora. Those 20 million Indian diaspora working in those countries are also sending money back to India from there, and they're called remittances. Okay, so lots of key terms here, but this is a really good one-page summary of why India is important culturally, politically, environmentally, and socially. So again, pause the screen to get any more notes you need, but this will all be there on the summary sheet that you did, A3 summary sheet for India, which identified different regions of India and some of the other factors, some of the other memberships, for example, that India is a part of. So India is also a place that's unevenly developed. So we looked at global uneven development, we looked at UK specific uneven development, but we're also focusing on India's uneven development and how it's changing. So we focus on 2 main areas, and this map actually looks at Goa and Bihar, but we don't focus on Goa and Bihar. We look at Mumbai and Bihar. Okay, so Mumbai in the Maharashtra region, which is just this blue section above Goa, and Bihar in the northeast section of India is less developed. Excuse me. So it is unevenly developed, and we call the less developed areas away from the economically advanced cities the periphery regions. And those periphery regions are less developed in a number of ways. They've got less infrastructure, poorer roads, less access to food. The economy is set up more agriculturally. They don't have technology available. There's no internet, for example. Sanitation is lower there. Job availability is lower. So all of those different factors about the periphery regions mean that they are less developed. But the core states, and they use Goa, again we use Mumbai in our lesson notes, but Goa is a good example as well. They have far higher incomes. They've got great access to the internet. They've got more reliable access to hospitals, better education standards, better road networks. They've got airports, railways, that sort of thing, and that really shows how uneven India is across. Those core areas are spread very intermittently across the country, and it's actually largely what you'd class as kind of a peripheral country. Any pink or light blue section on that map is really much more periphery based regions, whereas those areas that are red, the three dots really, are the core kind of regions. Now, India is changing, and we know that a lot of that change is economically based around employment, and this you would have encountered in your lessons looking at the triangle graph. So there's a double lesson on skills that we did where you looked at bar charts, line graphs, pie charts, triangle graphs. And the triangle graph showed you how India's employment structure had changed. And so primary sector changes, okay, that have occurred. Obviously, India was primarily agricultural. It still is a fairly agricultural country in terms of the amount of contribution from GDP, but actually agriculture has gone from 58% down to 26% of jobs in the population, and that's because they've increased their investment in mechanisation, so tractors doing the work of many more people. That said, India still relies quite heavily on rice and paddy fields, and as a result of that, it still has, because technology in paddy fields is less effective, and they still have a very high proportion of people employed in agriculture. Now, the impacts of that reduction in agriculture means that there are less jobs in rural areas, in periphery areas, so they migrate. Just like in Mexico City, you get rural to urban migration, and the family unit breaks down, and it's a bit, it's a cultural and social impact on the family unit, but it also leads to the same issues that we saw in changing cities for Mexico City, development of shanty towns. One of the biggest slum in the world is the slums of Mumbai. Over 1 million people live in them, and 2 million, I think, is the estimate. And the associated other factors that, again, I'd refer you back to your changing cities topic, Mexico City, to look at. Now, what's happened in the secondary sector is that India has industrialised, but much more slowly than China. So China really boomed in its secondary industry, whereas India only went up from 15% of jobs to 22%. And so that hasn't really had a huge effect, other than to have the knock-on impact of any growth of industry, more air pollution, greater proportion of people living in cities, and as those urban areas that have manufactured have developed, it's widened the gap between those core places and the periphery areas. Now, tertiary is where India's growth has really boomed. It's nearly doubled from 27% of jobs or employment to 52%. So more than half of India's employment is now in tertiary service sectors, and that has again led to rural to urban migration, but it's also been the reason why India's economy has massively boomed, and they are really, really benefiting from this growth of tertiary sector. They're also really booming in the quaternary sector, the fastest growing telecoms market in the world, although that's declining slightly, the second largest wireless network in the world, although again only in the core regions, the periphery still struggling a bit. But as that grows and spreads, more foreign direct investment, FDI, from TNCs, big companies, has increase the number of job opportunities, over 1 million new ICT jobs being created. Now, these figures that you can see here, they vary all the time, and in some of the lessons you would still assume, we look at the technology lesson for India, it says that 58% of India's population rely on agriculture. Now, we know that that's gone down to 26%, but 26% is still more than 1 in every 4 job. Now, not a quarter of this class don't work in agriculture. A quarter of my lessons, students in this country, their parents aren't farmers, because most of the jobs are in the tertiary sector. Well over 70%, of the jobs are in the tertiary sector in this country. So even though they've gone to 52%, there's still a way to go. But that has been a really big factor in their economic development, which they're investing well in education and healthcare. So there you go, a good summary of changes to employment in India and how it's led to their development change. Trade, aid and investment, which was the other part of the graphs lesson that we looked at. So flow line maps, and this is a slightly better flow line map than I gave you to try and do. Imports and exports. India were a closed off country, and we've already mentioned that in this session, but they lifted trade barriers and they increased massively the imports and exports to and from India, which has opened up trade hugely. And their trading policies have led to, since the 90s, have led to this huge rise in imports and exports. And it was in the top 20 countries in the world for exporting goods and merchandise, and that is a big accolade considering they're classed as a less developed country or an emerging country. It was also ranked eighth in the world for exporting commercial services. So that essentially is non-manufactured goods services. So exporting their service sector rather than products. What they mostly export are things like oil, but they also export products like gems and jewellery as well. And key imports, things that they get into India, are crude oil, often from places like Brazil, and other, the other OPEC or oil-producing nations. But they also buy in gold, silver, and electrical goods, which they then process, manufacture, either to sell within India. As they get wealthier, there will be a greater market for that, or process and sell on and export. And with regards to trade, aid and investment, there's a little exam skills practice for you here. So it's self-explanatory. Watch the graph, answer the question, or look at the graph, answer the question, and pause the screen, have a go, and I'll reveal the answer in about 3 seconds. There you go. So this answer, from 2004 to 2012, international aid received remained considerably higher than aid given. But by 2014, the aid given was higher than the aid received. And this just shows you the difference between aid in India. And India used to require much more aid, but now, as it's developing economically speaking, it's improving, or it's actually giving more aid than it's receiving, which is a sign that it's developing economically very fast. And this summary of public versus private investment shows you the difference between where countries kind of get money put into them. So public investment is when the government of that country spends money in that country. So that tends to be, in this country is a good example to use it. The government take our taxes from our salaries and invest it in policing, education, transport, housing, all those things, healthcare. And they're called public services for that reason. Okay, so the public services, the things that we all benefit from, the public pay for. When it comes to private investment, that's where businesses come in to try and exploit certain things like labour, workforces, natural resources, and that can often be quite big because the company is making massive profits. It's harder to spend loads of money from the public sector because if the government is spending loads of money on stuff, people want to know because it's their money, that it's coming out of their salaries. So this just explains the difference in public and private investment, and it gives you an India-specific focus, particularly with the private investment. TNCs have invested massively in India's economy, and that has really helped them develop faster. How has India's population changed? Well, we did an activity where we looked at actually 3 population pyramids, and this has narrowed it down to just 2, so they've missed out one in between, and you can see that changing shape represents India's growth of development. So life expectancy was much lower in 1985 because you can see by the narrowing of the pyramid, the death rate was far higher, birth rate was very high, but as India's developed, the birth rate's gone down, the death rate has declined, and you've got a narrowing of the sides of the pyramids and the straightening of them, which is far more like a country you'd expect at stage 3 or stage 4 of its demographic transition. So children are surviving longer, and therefore the birth rate's going down. And you've got a good portion of stats here which tell you that. So in 85, the population was much lower than it is, but its life expectancy has obviously gone up massively, and there's the proportions. When you look at population structure, it's really asking you, how has the number of or proportion of people under 15 changed? It's gone down. How has the number of people economically active changed? It's gone up because more people are surviving. And what's happened to the number of people aged 65 plus? They've also gone up in India as the life expectancy has increased. Okay, and that's very typical of any country as they develop. So life expectancy, this graph shows it much more clearly. Life expectancy in 1950 in India was just over 35, whereas in 2010 and beyond, it's gone up past 65. So that is a huge growth, nearly doubling of life expectancy in just in half a century, really. And this tells you some of the more specific statistics with regards to life expectancy, which, again, if you want to get any of these down, please pause the screen and jot those down, and I'm going to carry on with the next part. So, changing population is kind of linked in with changing social factors, and when it comes to the population change and the wealth and the investment in the core areas, there are certain consequences as a result of that, and there is an increased inequality. In India, the places that are getting the investment are still small areas, and there is a huge gap between the rich and the poor of India. So poverty is still a major factor. Culturally speaking, India and the caste system doesn't help this, but women often still have a lower status, and poorer women specifically have a lower status. There are places in India like Kerala where women are absolutely regarded much more highly and encouraged to go to university and get higher education, and that's actually hugely affected their population structure and their birth rates and things like that massively. And they're a real success story in terms of emancipating women in Kerala, but it's not even across the entire nation. And the elderly are not. I mean, you look at the population pyramid. I'll go back. The elderly are not hugely living. There's not. Although life expectancy has increased massively, they're still not benefiting from the economic changes necessarily. But that will change as things go. Education has improved. That's a good thing, and development and this changing population means that there's better investment in schools, and the government are seeing the benefits of having an educated workforce. So literacy rates gone up, but also birth rates going down, which lowers class sizes. It also improves the availability of education places for children, and so therefore the education is going to go up as a whole. And they've also got a very strong private education sector. So we'd call that the independent schools, like the fee-paying Greshams and Langleys and Norwich schools of this world. They've got a quite strong and well developed in India. And they've also got a growing middle class. So people with a higher income, higher education standard are what's kind of into the middle class areas, and they are able to buy more stuff. So they increase the market for selling goods within India, which in turn redevelop or help them invest that money back in. Because if you can produce goods in India but also sell goods to a wealthy middle class in India, you can keep your money in India and help it develop economically. One of the sort of latter stages of this, and we're really like only a couple of slides away from finishing this whole summary, is looking at how India interact with the rest of the world, and that's called geopolitics. So geographical politics, and India's relationships with certain nations have been really positive, and the UK is a great example, a former colony, a part of the jewel in the crown of the empire they were formerly known as, and we've retained really good aid and trade links with India through the Commonwealth, and we have very much a great geopolitical relationship with India, which is beneficial for them, but also for us in the long run, because they're going to be a huge economy by 2050. World's second biggest economy on the planet. They've also got good relationships with China, and Pakistan, but again, they've been a bit more fractious at times, and there's been military threats and territory disputes. The Kashmir region, for example, of India, the northwest of India, is disputed in part with Pakistan as to who effectively owns that, or has rights to that territory. And so you need to be aware of just how India's politics have affected its development, but also that the idea of technology and the digital divide in India and what India are doing to overcome that. So when you look at things like the biometric identification project, or the Aadhaar it's called, smartphone apps for farmers, the call centre industry, the X Prize Foundation, and the Swadhyaya Slate, the healthcare product, it's hoping to try and overcome this digital divide in India and lead to better development overall. India is now it's snuck into the top 10 most powerful countries, and it'll only get up. It'll only go up more and more as time goes by and they become wealthier. Now, this is just a good summary about technology and connectivity, and with this thing about the digital divide, important concept to understand. So again, it's a concept that the exam board might refer to, the difference between the access to technology and internet connectivity and stuff like that between the core and the periphery areas, or the urban and the rural areas, is very, very stark in India. And even though India has 590 million mobile phone users, it's still only got, that's still less than half its population. And even though India's broadband is one of the biggest networks in the world, it still has the biggest offline population anywhere in the world, because of how different the periphery and how undeveloped and unevenly developed the country is in terms of its core and periphery. And the stat at the bottom there, but in 2013, I know it's an old stat, but more than half of India's broadband connections were only in 5 of the states of India. So 29 states in India, and 5 of them had more than half the broadband connections. So, not a lot of broadband spread about India, but that will develop, hopefully, as India's wealth develops, and things like smartphone apps for farmers, which increase their crop yields, increase their profit margins, mean that there's more money locally to invest in things like masts and electricity networks and other ways to connect India digitally. And the growing wealth means that people can afford mobile phones that maybe do connect to the internet, smartphones, for example. Okay, so other aspects of geopolitics that you need to be aware of: foreign policy. So India's foreign policy that are aiming to actively build positive links with countries like France, Canada, and Germany, which are global players. Big investment opportunities as well. Canada, for example, is going to provide India with uranium, so India can develop nuclear technology, nuclear energy, and that's going to be really good for India's development. In terms of defence, India want to try and link with the USA, the biggest and most powerful army, not probably the biggest, but the most powerful and most well-equipped armed forces on the planet, the USA, are going to try and share warships, routes, fighter planes and military personnel with them to help provide humanitarian aid for a good thing. A lot of the military aren't just going to fight wars. In fact, we don't want them to. They're going to go and help places that are suffering with disasters, that need assistance, humanitarian assistance and stuff. Other military pacts India signed with Russia as well, to, again, missiles, jets, that sort of thing. And we've talked about the territorial disputes with China, and disputes with Pakistan over things like the Kashmir region and building of dams. This is all tied into this whole topic of geopolitics, and you need to just be aware of how India is related, or how India's conducting kind of its business with other parts of the world, and why India is a big player globally, and it's forging positive links with major players of the world like the USA and Canada and Germany and the UK through the Commonwealth, but also it has got some historic negative disputes with places like China and Pakistan, who are its near neighbours, and China particularly a bigger player than India globally, economically speaking, and therefore somewhere where there's a bit of local competition. Okay, now this is the very final slide of this summary for you of the global development topic, and this really is just an opportunity for you to start extending some answers. So rapid development, and India's rapid development, has obviously brought about massive positives for India. But just like any change, it's brought about negatives too. And really this table is a starting point which you need to finish in your notes, to give you a summary of the social positives and negatives, environmental positive and negatives, and economic positives and negatives of rapid development. Now, this is not to be confused with Mexico City, which is where we look at the positives and negatives of rapid urbanization and rapid population change. This is focusing solely on rapid development. So I've started off the positives and negatives for you, and you can see from the green plus and the red minus, which is positive, which is negative, but you need to finish it off. So I've put like a little connective for you. So you've got a kind of a developed explanation practice built in. Environmentally, I can't think of any more than one positive, so you can leave that one as just one, but the others you need to really try and build on, so you create a really good summary overall of the impacts, both positive and negative, of rapid development in India, socially, environmentally, and economically. Okay, and that will summarise and finish off this whole topic of global development. So I know you've had to listen for an incredibly long time, and I appreciate that it's really difficult, and hopefully you've paused and made extra notes, or it's helped accompany your notes that you've already got from lessons and boosted your understanding, or you've got a list of questions for me which will help with regards to your revision with anything you're not sure about. Thank you for listening. Again, all these revision sessions are always long, and there'll be another one coming soon for, I'm sure, another one of the topics that's lacking, but hopefully this has helped, and good luck.